Welcome to the TWIML AI podcast. I'm your host, Sam Charrington. This episode is a part of our TWIMLcon sponsor series. We are super grateful to these companies for supporting the event and excited to share a bit about what they presented at the conference and what they're up to in the machine learning space. This episode features my conversation with Paul Vanderboor of Prosus. To learn more about Prosus, check out their tech blog by visiting TWIMLai.com/Prosus. If you missed this year's TWIMLcon AI Platforms conference, you can still take advantage of 20 plus hours of video presentations, workshops, and discussions from the event, featuring presentations from ML practitioners and leaders at companies like Spotify, Netflix, Shopify, Google, Walmart, and many more. Visit TWIMLcon.com/on-demand for more information and to access this amazing resource. Thanks for listening, and on to the show. All right, everyone. I am here with Paul Vanderboor. Paul is Senior Director of Data Science at Prosus. Paul, welcome to the TWIML AI podcast.
Good to be back.
It is great to reconnect with you following TWIMLcon. Very grateful for Prosus's support of the event. And this is the second time we've done TWIMLcon and the second time that you've participated in it. And maybe we'll just start by having you share a little bit about your background, but also, we got to know one another based on you having listened to the podcast for a while. So, how did that come to be?
Yeah, absolutely. I indeed, you could call me a TWIML groupie. So I've been listening to the podcast for a long time. I always enjoyed the guests you had on the show, and was very excited when we got the chance to participate in the first TWIMLcon. I have maybe to take a step back. So my background is in engineering. Started in aerospace engineering, then worked a little bit of time in industry, designing turbines, and then moved on to do a PhD at Carnegie Mellon, after which I spent some time in consulting, helping clients, ramp up their data science efforts, and then spent quite a bit of time, helping grow the Data Science for Social Good Foundation, which I believe you know as well, with Raid Ghani. And since then moved to work almost full time at Prosus, basically, where I helped build the AI team that's there today. And that's also in that role, I got to participate in the first TWIMLcon, which, as you know, there's no dearth in AI conferences out there. And we try to, participate in, a couple a year, but have to always choose wisely. And, while there's a couple of very good research conferences that, actually we met at the first one in the first time we met was at NeurIPS. And that's one example. There's many others, but there's not so many practical focused or applied conferences with, experienced practitioners talking about, what they're experiencing on the front of bringing and applying machine learning and bringing that into production at scale. And I think that was, for me, the real, let's say, joy of participating in the first TWIMLcon edition. And to be honest, again, in the second time. So that's exactly how I experienced, let's say, the biggest value of meeting other folks that are dealing with very similar challenges when it comes to, applied settings that is very different than just the research challenges that we also work on and face all sorts of different challenges. So.
For folks who don't know, why don't you share a little bit about Prosus?
Yeah, so Prosus is one of the largest consumer internet companies out there. It's actually a tech investor. We always joke it's the largest company you haven't heard of. So we're over $150 billion listed in the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, and we focus on a couple of consumer-focused segments. And I'll name them just so you get a bit of a sense of what the products are and the problems that we deal with, also from a data science point of view. So the first one is food delivery. So we have a couple of big food delivery operations in various parts of the world, mostly in growth markets. So in India and Brazil, we have let's say the leading food delivery players. Then we also have a edtech segment. So it's educational technology, in which we have various businesses that we've invested in that have their own, let's say, AI challenges. Then we have a big group of companies that focus on secondhand marketplaces. We call that classifieds. In particular, a brand called OLX, which is in over 40 countries, different parts of the world. There's 300 million active users on a monthly basis. again, it's in mostly in growth markets. So, Eastern Europe, Russia, India, a lot of South America. And then we have a fourth segment that we call payments, basically. So we have a big payment gateway operator that's operational all over the world, but a heavy base also in India.
Mm. So one of the things that I think that TWIMLcon does really well is bringing folks together to share their experiences operationalizing and productionalizing machine learning from a bunch of different perspectives. But you actually have that within Prosus because you've got so many companies that you work with that are bringing models to production. And that was really the focus of your presentation at the conference, which was called Building ML Platform Capabilities at Global Scale. Can you talk a little bit about the presentation and what you shared with the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. Indeed, because we have many different businesses that are part of the Prosus group, which each have their own, AI teams and AI operations. I'm part of the central Prosus AI team, and I get the pleasure to work with many of those teams and look at the different challenges they face. And within Prosus, we've built this global community of data scientists that we call the Data Science Guild, that has hundreds of data scientists that meet on informal, formal basis or several times a year to discuss and share use cases and problems that they face. And of course, one of the things that all of these teams are working on is the topic of machine learning platforms, and as was of course also the goal of TWIMLcon, let's say, is a key subject there. So what I spoke about during the presentation was basically how different parts of the businesses have chosen to build a different approach in building machine learning platform capabilities. All of them have very similar problems, but as you can imagine, the ML platform requirements that would be needed for delivering, a food order in Delhi in an average under 30 minutes, like we see at Swiggy, is very different than a machine learning platform that would need to satisfy tens of millions of listings that are uploaded on our classifieds platforms where users are trying to buy and sell goods. It's a lot of user generated content, it needs to be moderated, for example, but also some of the goods we try and do price prediction. So it's very different nature of the problems, also different data modalities, looking at image data, text data. Maybe if you go back to food delivery, you have logistics and how you sort of try and optimize that entire space. So the presentation was focused on the differences in the machine learning platform capabilities that we've seen, but also highlighting what are some of the common things that we see, right? Which is those are equally interesting. And I think the underlying message was that, let's say, a thread in the conversation that I also have with many of the business leaders in these organizations are about using machine learning and the platforms to really scale, right? So each of the businesses, I spoke about 3 businesses that we have, basically have hundreds of millions of users, have to cater to tens of millions of in food delivery orders a month. As I mentioned, millions of listings get uploaded a day. At these kinds of volumes, the role of the platform becomes much more than a nice to have. It becomes basically essential to having machine learning operations in production in a reliable way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think your presentation really goes a long way towards illustrating why a one size fits all kind of approach to machine learning platforms isn't likely to be the right answer, right? You've got these very different businesses under the same umbrella. If any place you were going to try to, hey, let's just centralize all of this and we'll have this, one machine learning central master environment, it would be Prosus. But you find that it's not just that in one case you have, a deep learning model, in another case you have an NLP model or a tabular data model. It's not just that the models are different, but the needs of a real-time use case are very different from the needs of a batch use case. And you've got these mapping use cases. I think if you take a step back and kind of think about what you've presented, like it's kind of these very organic evolution of solutions to particular problems. I wonder how much you agree with that. If all of a sudden, all of those, I don't know what the right way to frame the scenario is. Like oftentimes a system evolves the way it evolves because of that history. But if you could start over, like you might do it differently. I'm wondering if Do you think about that at all? If you could start over with all of these businesses, would you still have these separate platforms off in their own directions? And would they be very different? Or could you ever imagine getting to kind of one master platform?
And that's a fascinating question. Believe me, we do talk about that a lot, actually, because we've asked ourselves a question. Well, just like you say, why don't we have or think about building some of these capabilities centrally? Because it seems like a logical question from the outside, right? But as soon as you go a little bit deeper, there's a couple of things that come into play. So the first one is this path dependency on sort of the architecture and the other infrastructure components in a company. And that means that, if you're moving in a certain way, you've already chosen certain tools. You can't just pretend it's a greenfield exercise and you're going to build this in a vacuum. You need to sort of think about the interfaces that you're going to have for the platform. And those are obviously going to be many, because it comes from the data side, on the serving side, on all the stuff that we talked about. So let's, for a moment, assume that you wouldn't have those path dependencies. And would you be able to build like a common machine learning platform across the group? I think even then it would be very difficult. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, is that you do have different business requirements, as I mentioned, right? So if there's a business that has a different nature, so payments, having to basically approve payments in a low latency, high velocity, high volume kind of way, versus predicting food delivery orders and managing all the logistics behind that, and then again classifieds. There's very, very different use cases, whether it's data modalities, real-time batch, those kinds of differences will actually have fundamentally different consequences for the architecture of your platform. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing to be gained by looking at this from a group level, right? And there are a couple of elements where we increasingly see that the benefit of trying to not do this all independently and crack the same problems again independently. I think it's one of the pieces is sharing what we experiences about tooling, right? There's so many tools that are coming out that are sometimes pretending or claiming that they can solve different parts of the ML platform capability list, let's say, and some of them do, right? But they will not work always for your situation. So by sharing some of that knowledge across the group, we can avoid having to make mistakes, or we can basically increase our learning, right, together. I think that's one thing we do quite a bit. In some cases, we also go a little bit further and actually help each other, take specific components, or let's say follow certain recipe books around how we've built a certain part of the platform, whether it's using, for example, the way we've set up our KF serving module, right, for real-time predictions. Well, there are certain people and teams in the group that have done that already. So let's actually take how they've done it, not what they've done, but how they've done it, and take that recipe and the lessons learned and re-implement it somewhere else. So there's a lot of knowledge sharing on that level. But there's also something which it's just the way things are, is that there's an important component of timing. So if you, and I think I discussed this as well in the presentation, if you were looking at some of these things 3 years ago versus you're trying to look at them today, the options that you would consider for building that capability are going to be very different. Yeah. So 3 years ago, you probably would have to build a lot more of the stuff yourself from the ground up. Whereas today, you've got a whole list of tools that are out there. It still is very hard to pick the right tool. I think that's definitely not trivial, because there's just so many, we haven't gotten to the point yet where there's a consolidated short list of, if you want to build your feature store, this is what you should do. I mean, there are a couple of good solutions out there, but actually, if you look at the entire list, it's probably dozens and dozens who claim to do that for you well. And so making a good choice for your situation is not trivial. And then, the question that we think about a lot is what does it look like in 3 years from now? Right. So
even if you could start over.
Exactly. Even if you could start over, will we go to a point where you can go and just, take this sort of end-to-end, tool? For example, is Kubeflow going in that direction? How much of the problem will that be able to solve? And we've seen a difference in adoption on that tool on its own. So, I mean, we had a joke in the team. If we had to drink a shot for every time we heard the word Kubernetes or Kubeflow during the TWIMLcon conference, we wouldn't make it to the end, right? Because it was just, the frequency was very high. But that also says something about the adoption of those tools. And so, I think there are signs that we're consolidating, or at least agreeing, converging to a set of tools. Mm-hmm. But I still think that even in 3 years, you will need to carefully look at the business requirements and see what the rest of the stack looks like to make a choice that works well for you. And it probably won't be a plug and play end-to-end tool that serves them all or rules them all.
Yeah, all that in mind, you offered, I thought, a really well put set of principles that has worked for your teams at Prosus. Can you go through, some of those and what they mean for you, how you've arrived at them?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. So one of the common lessons learned, or at least things that we saw work well in choosing the let's say the architecture for the platform, is making sure you abstract in some way the complexities of the underlying infrastructure away from the end user. And to make it specific, like a lot of these models in the end need to serve a prediction and need to serve a score, and making sure that score can be made accessible in a standardized way, hopefully some standardized API format that doesn't differ too much across the use cases, makes it a lot easier to integrate actually those models into a production use case for if you want to experiment or doing green blue testing or whatever, all those things that you want to do before you sort of go full on in production. If you have a standardized API, then the front end teams that need to do that integration or the other engineering teams will find it much easier to do if they only need to learn, or we all only need to agree on one or two ways of doing that, instead of if you have 200 models, 200 different ways. Mm-hmm. And so you kind of need to standardize that. And the second thing is you can also do that sometimes by creating a kind of a user face that abstracts the underlying pieces away. So it doesn't really matter for the end user. They basically just select the model that they want to consume or look at or monitor or whatever, and they don't need to look at, well, is this a batch model, real time? Is this using KF-serve or some other approach? Is it, all that stuff then doesn't become the worry of the end user that does the integration. That's one piece. Another reason for doing that, by the way, is actually besides that it becomes easier to adopt and integrate, and the velocity over the entire workflow gets higher, is that if you need to swap out underlying components, so maybe you need to change a different tool, you can do that without the end user being worried about about changes to their way of consuming the model. Mm-hmm. And again, that comes back to the other point. The landscape is changing quite rapidly, and so you probably want to have, in any case, a couple of tools working concurrently in parallel, and maybe to for yourself learn if those are the things you want to be using or settle on, but also to try new tools as they become available. And that becomes much easier if you haven't just trained hundreds of engineers in your organization onto one specific way of doing things, because now you're locked in a way, right? Because now you have to retrain or reskill or whatever if you change a different tool, and it has all sorts of then downstream consequences. So thinking about, let's say, standardization, but also abstraction between different users that allows you to basically have a flexible design or design for change as we look at it setup. So I think those are a couple of things that I mentioned during the talk. I'm not sure there's other ones you had in mind, but
yeah, no, that's exactly it. There were a couple of others, like building for the long term and not reinventing the wheel, and some other ideas. But overall, I think what I really loved most about your presentation was kind of the side-by-side view, fairly, deep level view on these different platforms that evolve to support these different use cases. And then the survey of, okay, what have you learned across all of these, and how does that help you architect, the N+1 system? It was really well done.
Thanks.
Thanks. You also attended a bunch of the other parts of the conference. You participated in the executive summit. What do you think overall? Any kind of big takeaways for you from the event overall?
Yeah, indeed, I attended lots of different parts. By the way, I love the change in format, from the team teardowns to sort of live Q&A to, the executive summit, but also the networking, even the debate. So I think that was refreshing. A couple of things that I enjoyed a lot because they're unique for me to TWIMLcon is the things you can get out of an executive summit. For example, like bringing that group of people together to talk about problems that they face. That was something that I took away uniquely from TWIMLcon, especially the discussion that we had in the session I was in on the executive summit was, for me, usually valuable, right? Sort of an open format discussion around what it takes to organize teams, the language you use, and these things. Mm-hmm. But more specifically, if I look at the other parts of TWIMLcon, I really enjoyed the team teardowns in particular, because those highlighted also the organizational aspect that you need to go through in building the platform. Because we tend to, I mean, it's also my bias in a way, having a technical background, you tend to gravitate to tooling. And that's what we geek out on, right? And that's fine. But in actually building this stuff in an organization, especially on something like an ML platform, it touches on so many stakeholders, right? And so many guilds and different roles in the team. You need to think about what you call different roles, right? So I loved I think it was the Spotify example where they had this
engagement manager.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
engagement manager. So it's like
incredible idea.
It's an incredible idea. It's like, okay, wait a second, that's not a role description I'd heard before. But the problem that the person Lex, I think, was trying to solve is the one we're all trying to solve in many different places. So I thought it's genius, right? It's nice. Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that I liked from the team teardowns, and of course, enjoyed listening to many of the other talks where people discussed the challenges they had in real life. Right?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, Paul, great as always to catch up with you, and thanks again for your participation and support of the conference.
Yes, thanks for having me, and look forward to the next one.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you. All right, everyone, that's our show for today. To learn more about today's guest or the topics mentioned in this interview, visit TWIMLai.com. Of course, if you like what you hear on the podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcatcher. Thanks so much for listening, and catch you next time.